Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. This episode is in the form of storytelling. These are real life stories where I'm sharing a story from a part of my journey that led to certain insights and realizations which have significantly shaped my teaching and the work at the Sequoia Samanvaya learning community which I started. In our last storytelling episode, I talked about how I came to recognize the importance of re-enchanting for sustainability. Here, I'm going to share about how I came to understand the work that I now refer to as remembering, which I see as essential, even a precursor, for the powerful potential of re-enchanting to occur. Whereas the last story was akin to a wandering journey, this story is more akin to a whirlpool. There was nothing neat about this moment in my life. You see, how I came to understand remembering is very much connected to my father's death. Here, I try to sketch a pattern from that chaotic moment through tracing the rivers that converged into this whirlpool of a time, changing my mind, my body, my soul, and situating me firmly in what I have come to see now as my destiny. Sometimes, on both my enchanting episodes of storytelling and myth casting, I play my flute. I want to tell you the story of this flute. This is a flute that's made in the Dakota Lakota tradition. I initially acquired it when I was at Serpent Mound in Ohio in the middle of the eclipse. And my previous flute, which was made of bamboo and given to me by some of the indigenous people on the island of Indonesia when I had been working on religion and sustainability out there. And they gave me this beautiful bamboo flute. I used it for many years and then it broke and it was just so devastating to me. And I was looking for a new flute, a new straight flute. And I saw this particular stand and these beautiful, beautiful instruments. And I played one of these instruments, the one I'm holding now, which is made of the rosewood tree. And the man who made them, he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "That flute is for you." And then he and I talked for a long time, and his wife and I talked. And they told me some of their stories about how he started making flutes as an adult. He didn't know anything about making flutes growing up. But he himself, I believe he was from Cherokee lineage, and he was deeply brokenhearted one day. And so because his mother and his sister had died, and he essentially locked himself into his garage and just wouldn't leave, wouldn't do anything. And he knew that if he didn't change something, that he was probably not going to survive himself. But he was in so much grief he couldn't stand to do anything. And then one day, a neighbor of his walked into his garage, carrying one of these flutes. His neighbor was of the Dakota tradition nation. And he looked at that flute and he said, "I need to learn how to make those flutes. Will you teach me?" And the man said, "Yes, come to my studio." And so he left the room and he followed the man the next day and he went to the studio and he began to make the flutes. And so they saved him from depression, and from rather the worst of his mental illnesses. So when I told him of how I use instruments, drums and flutes and other instruments in my healing practice, and told him some of my teachers and some of the work that I was doing, he was he was very happy, and he said, I give you my blessing to use this flute. And for a while after I left, we would correspond, and I sent him some of my early recordings of the flute, and I think it made him happy. He said it made him happy. And I tell that story in part because to share an instrument is to share the life force of the maker and of the instrument itself. I couldn't just sit down and play the piano, although I hope to also be interweaving piano music into some of these stories, because I love playing the piano. If I didn't really tell you the story of the piano and the story of where it comes from, the story of the flute, you miss something. And in the folk traditions that I come from, you always tell the story of the instrument. The instrument itself has its own character, its own story. And the other reason I like to tell that story is because it situates me in relationship to another people, in this case, to a people who have a tradition of the Dakota's flute making tradition. And it shows how I relate to them. And it helps to tell some of their stories and some of their experiences with healing in this time. And it lifts up the power of music and song, of engaging and taking steps outside of those barn doors that so many of us have found ourselves in. Those times when we are so overwhelmed by the world and by the ugliness, the death, divorce, war, climate change. And sometimes the only pathway to healing is through making something of beauty, whether it be for ourselves or whether it be for someone else. Usually for someone else is sometimes easier than making things for ourselves. But to put the craft into the work. For 7 years, I was unable to speak of what happened in the wake of my father's death. The truth was too voluminous to speak, to squeeze into words. It was as much as I could do to just live it. My father's death interrupted the flow of my life, like a whirlwind, dropping me beneath the river I thought I knew and into the raging currents of waters far beneath the surface. Centuries long, quote-unquote, past came flooding in, churning through my previous conceptions of present and future. People and places flow through what was suddenly the delta of my existence. Generations of ideas of what it means to be a Wolcott, my family, an American, a woman of European descent, my father's daughter, drowned. Passing through the gateway of the 7-year anniversary, which is this year, enough time for my cellular structure to die and grow again, is enabling a renewed set of words to flow, shaped not by the mind but by my experience. My current work ministry life is only possible because of my father's death. That is what has been so hard for me to really share, and the sacred confluence of life rivers that emerged from it. Perhaps that's the nature of death. And when he lifts up his trident and strikes down on the waters of life, a new space opens, an axis from which a vortex may form. A vortex in which the convergence of the elements can lead to anywhere, to further death, to further life, to emerging of the two and the emergence of a different life. This is how it opened. The weekend that Robert Kent Wolcott died in his bed in my family home in a wooded plot of land in the East Bay area of California, not too far from where he was born, was the same weekend as the 2014 Great Climate Protests in New York City, kitty-corner to my home in Manhattan. Hundreds of thousands of people converged on the streets, marching from one end of town to another, calling for justice and for the possibility of the continuation of human life on Earth. My colleagues, teachers, and mentors at Union Theological Seminary, where I was studying eco-theology, had dedicated months to organizing a significant climate service at St. John's Cathedral. I attended the service, though I had learned of my father's passing only that morning. When Al Gore, whom my father deeply admired, stood up to give his talk, he spoke of how proud he was of his daughter, Karenna Gore, whom I was lightly working with, and who had also done so much to organize the gathering under the banner of the Center for Earth Ethics, hosted by Union. I started bawling. Great big heaves of tears, trying as hard as I could not to make any sounds. I mean, really, who cries at Al Gore's talks? In that moment, overwhelmed by grief, I don't think I could have explained what I was experiencing had someone asked me. I was so grateful no one did. Of course, it was about how much I wanted my father with me, in the flesh, listening to this talk, at a gathering put on by my friends and colleagues and networks, as I was in the midst of becoming a minister, also known as a teacher, who guides people in developing their own and our collective relationship to the Holy One. I don't think I could have really expressed how much pain it gave me to realize, to just begin to realize. I was only just beginning to understand that gaping sense that my father would never see what I would do. Nevertheless, I felt his presence in the cathedral. At the subsequent memorial service, when I returned to Union, I struggled to make sense of his absence and of his life. In this search for meaning, which felt more like dropping into a hole of non-meaning, the questions began to swirl, wrapping tighter and then looser, catching the currents of larger ones, of my inheritance, of my ancestry, of the stories that were not always true, of the half-lives, of the things that should not have happened, quote-unquote. Can life even have shoulds? of the nature of privilege, of whiteness, of how the system doesn't work for the people it's supposed to work for. Anger, fear, grief, frustration, agony, loneliness. I felt his presence, I felt his love. The questions spurred me, not in some logical, linear way, but into an eddy of spiraling currents. They intermingled with my courses and the people I was marching with as New York City experienced its first major wave of Black Lives Matter. Somehow the questions and that inner guidance that so often for me is more of a sense than a vision or a voice swirled into my studies and my work. The classroom, of all places, became gateways into flows of ancestral experiences framed as questions. Let's take, for example, one of the most important courses. My work with the Dr. James Cone, often considered the father of Black liberation theology. I don't remember the words that Cone said to me when I told him that my father had passed. Only the sense that he looked at me with his kind, steady presence, and I felt buoyed by his compassion and his confirmation that there was a very good time for me to be in his much sought-after seminar on theodicy, the study of evil. I come from a family that had long existed within and perpetuated relationships that are, in the words of the great mystic and philosopher Howard Thurman, evil in design. Perhaps one of the earliest critical observations I had was that if our family, who were amongst the founding families in the United States of America, had so much privilege, why did we also have so much suffering? Why was my father haunted by a depression so severe that it wrapped some of his otherwise good sense and led him to do things that were distinctly inappropriate? Or was there perhaps a relationship between these things? Did the privilege which itself arose in large part from white settlers' theft of native land, stealing of black bodies and forcing them into labor and thus participating in evil, give evil the opening to swirl into their own body minds, infesting them with not only hard hearts, but a sickness of the mind? Did my family's colonial histories in some way explain their ongoing struggles with mental illness? Who is the devil but a fallen angel? I recall that Cone referred to theodicy as the ultimate theological question. He framed it, as was his wont, quite simply as, if Jesus was God's only begotten Son, the Savior of the world, the fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth, as promised by the Hebrew prophets, why was the world still suffering? Why was there still evil in the world? Why, indeed? A variation of this question is also, if the world is good, why do bad things happen? Or, alternatively, why do good people do evil things? Another variation is, if creativity and art is supposed to save us, why does it sometimes kill us? You see, my father died in large part because he had written himself to death. My father's mental illness worsened over time into a form of an obsession that he writ large into hundreds of notebooks. As he talked less and less, shrinking into a shadow of himself, he turned again and again to those notebooks, bending over them with all the care and devotion of a priest. He wrote thousands of pages of variations of a theme of self-hatred and self-flagellation that echoed the worst of the self-punishments of a far crueler time and far crueler monasteries. I, as a writer, shudder to call such spells of self-destruction writing. I want to uplift our craft. When my mother and I cleaned out the house after he died, we found hundreds of notebooks, all with the same set of words and phrases in them, most of which was harmful and destructive to his own sense of well-being. We treated the notebooks like poison. Just get them out of the house. We filled an entire 50-pound garbage can. In Cohen's class, we rode the river of theodicy through literature, theology, philosophy, and personal reflection. James Baldwin, Dostoevsky, Hannah Arendt, Susan Neiman's Evil in Modern Thought. Riding the current of theodicy was made bearable by the people in the boat along with me. Most of my fellow classmates were BIPOC organizers and pastors. All had listened long and hard to the questions of evil in America, especially in the form of racism, homophobia, and gendered violence. Cone himself was famous for refusing to let slide the racism deep within Christianity, the academy, seminary. The question why morphed as we kept asking it. The beauty of the literature and the poetry and the stories both lifted up and eased the pain. The answer, quote unquote, that we, as a collective group of diverse participants, kept circling around was deceptively simple. We don't know why. But we do know that when evil occurs, what matters is less why than how you respond. You need to do what you can to stop it, and you need to create, to sing, craft, write, string wampum, engage with art. That might sound simple. It isn't. The death writing that my father engaged in does not negate the life writing that I can engage in. Writing, art, creativity, it's akin to a tool wrapped in magic, for art can transcend the multiple dimensions of time and space, and into the more than human world. Like any tool, it can destroy, even as it can heal. At the end of that course, I wrote about my father's favorite spiritual song, a song he sang all the time back when he was still singing. Swing low, sweet chariot. Now, looking back, I don't remember much about what was in that paper. I do recall crying while writing it. I sang that song to myself, to my room, alone, as I wrote the paper. I remember what Cone said, that the paper was brilliant, that I needed to keep writing. I admit, for the past 7 years, I have not been able to keep a journal. When Cone died, just a few years after I participated in his seminar, I sat out on my stoop, under the stars, and sang that song for him. Swing low, sweet chariot, come and go to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, come and fall to carry me home. Later, I was in a room. The room was in the building. The room had 2 windows. One window looked out onto the quad of Union Theological Seminary, a green space, a sacred space, the space where we could all gather. 2 trees were in the quad. The other window looked out onto the street, Broadway. If you took Broadway down far enough, you would get to the theater district, the lights, the noise, the musicians, the dancers. But right outside that window, it was just another street corner. In Manhattan, lots of honking. Across from the Jewish Theological Seminary and the bagel shop, and a place where eventually I printed my thesis. In that moment, I didn't know that I was about to discover what my thesis was going to be. I didn't know I was about to have a conversation that would change my life. I was in that room volunteering for the Center for Earth Ethics, for Krennicor, who I mentioned earlier, gathered together a number of climate justice leaders from across the area, mostly Indigenous activists, Black activists, Latino activists, all of whom were working on various intersections of social justice and climate change. There was a moment when there was a break. I talked to someone I happened to be standing next to. He worked for the Indian Law Alliance, Betty Lyons, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Onondaga Nation. I asked him a question that I have probably asked 100 times in my life, especially when I was working overseas in international development. How can we help you? And he responded, well, we want what we've always wanted, what we've wanted for 500 years. We want to repeal, to rescind the doctrine of discovery. I did a step back. What was he talking about? I vaguely knew, maybe kinda, that the doctrine of discovery was a set of papal bulls written by the popes in the 14th, 15th century. Something about the beginnings of colonization. I had no idea what that had to do with eco justice or climate change or why we were all gathered together in that moment. I just nodded. I don't even remember what I said. Mostly I remember thinking, something's here that I don't understand. Now, maybe if that conversation had not happened in the wake of my father's death, maybe if I wasn't in the middle of taking classes with James Cone, maybe if I wasn't in seminary, I don't know that conversation would have gone anywhere, if I would have thought much about it later. But something was not sitting with me. Why? What was he talking about? Why was he linking the doctrine of discovery to climate change? Because he was. And that began a question. It took months, in some ways years, to fully appreciate the extent to which he's right. If we can take the liberty of comparing the doctrine of discovery to a river, which might be insulting to rivers, then it would be a river that is so deep in the ground of what is the United States, and also the rest of the modernized, property-focused world, that we don't see it anymore. We might say that it was a spring from which colonization flowed. If it was an underground aqueduct, it would be the one that the farmers keep drawing upon to water their almonds in California. It is consistently drawn upon to grow an entirely unsustainable society. Climate change derives from colonization, not from the Industrial Revolution. The doctrine of discovery was the root of European colonization. To address climate change, you need to address the doctrine of discovery. If we, as a world, want to move away from climate change, we need to stop drinking from this river. We need to undo, dismantle, disentangle, and in so very many ways unsettle the doctrine of discovery's continued legal, moral, and institutional hold on our culture, our minds, and our world. That kernel of the idea became my thesis, remembering the origins of climate change into the doctrine of discovery. Now, here's the thing about the river of history. It's personal. The journeying along the history of the doctrine of discovery was so turbulent to my life because it was converging with the river of grief from my father's death and my study of theodicy. The personal dynamic within these histories was not a separate river. I was not separate. I am with it. To study the history was to study my ecological family history, my family's relationship with other families, with other beings, with other places. And in the wake of my father's death, I came to tell my family's story differently. When my forefathers landed in what they call Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1635, they could not have survived those first few years without the direct support of the people who were already here, including but not only the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, The same is true when my ancestors, Henry Wolcott and his kin, went west a few years later, walking for well over a week, stopping near a river now known as the Connecticut River. They originally tried to settle too close to the river, which floods in the winter. Some of the local people showed them a better place to stay. Without their help, my family would have died. Without their help, I would not be here. And given the pivotal role that small group of people came to play in what became the United States of America, we can say that without their help, our country would not be here. Our lives today are deeply intertwined with peoples who I thought had all died off from plagues and genocides. My land is their land, and they are still here. Somewhere around this time began the miracles. Perhaps that is why convergences are so sacred. In the swirl can arise miracles as well as destruction. Just one example, just one rapid. Fortune of fate led me to the Canadian gathering of the final report of their multi-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was entranced with a workshop on the legal structure of land and the doctrine of discovery, led by an Indigenous man who himself had been deeply involved with the commission. I lingered, a bit starstruck, after the workshop, and in a very regular way, we asked each other where we were from. In such an ordinary conversation, it soon became clear that some of his ancestors would have known and possibly directly interacted with some of my ancestors, who dubbed their little church and town Dorchester, after the city in England from which they had set sail. Flabbergasted, I started muttering an apology for what my ancestors had done. I found myself beginning to kneel before him. With a raised eyebrow and a tiny smile, he stopped me in mid-sentence, intuiting what I was going to say next. "You know," he said, "there were many people who were hurt and damaged. But don't forget, there were also those who loved across cultural differences. That is also part of the story." I almost cried. To be reminded of love, not just hatred. To meet the descendants of the people my ancestors harmed and be reminded of love. The power of grace I experienced in that moment lifted me, and something in a part of my soul I have no name for breathed. It was a moment of remembering, when disparate parts of the dismembered human earth body can come together again. My family is only here because of your family. My land is also your land. I'm here because you are here. We are here because of the lands and the waters and the air and the sky, and we are here by and by, lands and the waters and the air and the sky. We are here by and by. Say the names. Wampanoag, Massachusetts, Nipmunks, Sequoia peoples, Pakunuk, Pudunk, Matabesek, Wapanegar Confederacy, the Pequot, the Mohegan, Lenape, Haudenosaunee. Swirl them in your tongue. Speak them out to the shadow on the river at dusk. Feel the sound of languages that were dismembered from tongues, the tongues dismembered from bodies, bodies dismembered from landscapes. Home, walking with my father under the oaks taller than sunshine. My father watching the sun splash into the Pacific Ocean, sending streams of pinks and purples across the belly of Isis. Home. 5 generations planting squash and beans in the rich California soil. 20 generations watching the constellations in this part of the sky. Did any of them know the stories of where those seeds come from? The stories of the constellations told by the people whom they displaced? While they pretended the convergence wasn't happening. one set of language displaced for another. When the convergence arose and came upon me, I swallowed. I was swallowed up, swirled around, could no longer ignore the face of my ancestors, the demon looking out of the rising smoke of the California fires. We are only still alive because of the care of others. My family history cannot stand alone. Some island in the middle of space? No, we are always and have been, only because existing of the convergence. Remember, remember, remember. You are only here because of families not your own. You are only here because of the more than human world. You are only here because of love, because someone suckled you, someone held you, and those hands were not always of your own blood. Yes, sometimes there was love. Somehow, amidst all the logic and justice, swells up grace. Swing low, sweet share. Who's there? Who's there? Who's gonna come to carry me home? Another moment. It was spring equinox. I had, for the first time, led an earth-honoring ritual with a dear friend, whom I saw as something of a sister in spirit. Now, when this moment happened, we were actually sitting in the course taught by the mystic and the brilliant South Korean feminist, Jang Hyung-kyung, who was teaching the course on ecofeminism. I had the flush of openness and the euphoria that accompanies wielding ritual power and walking in liminal spaces. Both of us were smiling at each other with glee. And then, was it the classmate, maybe an outside guest, read aloud from Malleus Maleficum, The Hammer of the Witches. That was a book used to weaponize a sadistic, anti-sensual, homophobic, anti-female, and classist version of a tiny section of the patriarchy into a force that terrified, tortured, and burnt hundreds of thousands of women during the great European witch hunts in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. Suddenly I was woozy, drifting, nauseous, going in and out of different realities. Behind me, standing at my back, I saw a line of mostly, but not only, women, stretching far back in time. A line of witches, standing beside or perhaps on top of a river of feminine power, listening, nodding their heads, hissing at the reading of the book. Yes, that's what it sounded like. Yes, that is what it was like. Lips raised in a snarl, body shriveled in pain and shame, muscles clenched. Fight, flight, freeze, regardless of the choice. Be burned. I laid my head on the table and moaned. My friend grabbed my arm, felt my brow, and escorted me out of the room. We sat on a bench outside of the classroom as I slowly shook. One of the guests for the day, a woman who knew a lot about witches and about women's power and really about being faithful to spirit, kneeled in front of me. My friend's dark-colored hand held me as I stared into the stranger's bright blue eyes as she willed me with her formidable power through what felt like a tiny keyhole in the wall of terror. If she muttered a spell, I don't recall. Her eyes pulled me through. My soul took a deep breath in, narrowed into the size of the keyhole she offered, and whooshed through to the other side. I shook and shook and shook. Centuries of shaking came out of me. So many tears I couldn't see, but I was through. You did it. You did it, my friend said as she held me. Or maybe she whispered something else. I don't remember the words, just the feeling. I do remember what she said next. You have gone through an initiation. We re-entered the classroom. I don't think I said anything, but maybe I did. Professor Chung, who always reminded me of a swallow, sounded so sweet, and so sharp in her accuracy of flight, watched me. When the presentations finished, she had us all gather in a circle. Standing shoulder to shoulder with my peers, I cried. The circle held me. With the initiation into my witchy lineage came a knowledge from my ancestors. The Pope at the time had issued a papal bull that ushered in the witch hunts. I later looked it up. It is known these days as the Witch Bull. It was written amidst the bulls that formed what we now know as the doctrine of discovery. Europe had harmed her own indigenous women, even as the evil was arising that would lead to colonization, and then to capitalism, and then to climate change. The inspiration for me making these historical connections, which I might say have been the topics I most often am asked to speak on, was hardly a linear research project. It was a mystical experience in the midst of a much wider convergence made possible by my father's death. My ancestors were calling me, reclaiming me into my rightful place to the more than human world, bending again and again. Hallowed times. Make me an instrument, nothing more. With these hands, I give them over. With these feet, I walk some more. With these knees, you see me bending. With this breath, I ask again. Make me an instrument of thy peace. Make me an instrument of thy love. Make me an instrument, nothing more. In the 7 years since my father's death, I've come to remember my family history in ways that incorporate the convergences of land and peoples, deceit and love, distance and connection, waterways and cycles of trade. Some of this remembering has led to me narration, though not all. Much of it still dwells in the moans and groans and aches and movements of personal, social, and our shared ecological bodies. When I teach on these dismembered histories, I use a linear timeline, but I strive to situate my students into their own emotional, physical, and familial land-body inheritance, the swirl of the whirlwind. I'm listening for the moment when they are sucked beneath the waves, breaking out of their colonized identities, enough to allow a deeper current to take them into a different direction. My life since that time has grown, changed, expanded, as our lives do. The weaving still continues. The threads still come together, the rivers still come together, the convergence still shapes my life. I moved out of New York City, eventually, after I started Sequoia Samanvaya, and started offering the ceremonies, rituals, and healing seed sessions that have actively engaging with the more than human world. I now live north of the city, in a place shaped by the rollingness of the ocean, a place that was once underwater, the Hudson Valley. I have fallen in love with a descendant of one of the leaders who sat in sacred circle with my great-grandfather back when the leaders of America still sat in the longhouse with our elder brothers, the leaders of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. My partner has spent the last 30 years on her own people's reservation. Her life has been as different as I can imagine from my own, and yet the resonance between us shines as bright as a full harvest moon. We live on what she often refers to as the Eastern Door, on what was once land cared for by the Mohawk people, also members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It is not that far from the Cohos, the place where the Hudson and Mohawk rivers converge, the place where members of the Confederacy and the Dutch gathered to exchange the first treaty between the Indians and the Europeans, the two row wampum. I live in the midst of the swirl between the old and the new, the broken and the healing, the sacred and the gathered and the dispersed, the remnants and the mystery of how they do and do not come together. I don't think I could have done any of this had my father not died. I kind of wish that wasn't true, but there it is. But that is what death does. It upends life. That old friend whom we will all meet at one point or another takes up his great trident and thrusts it into our rivers as he takes out yet another swimming creature, and the swirl emerges. And the past and the present, the ancestors and the future beings, keep swirling. This was a journey in how I learned to remember. That is a somatic and spiritual experience, not just a narration. All mixed together like water flowing. That there is a force of love within the whirlwind. And that spirit has a way of leading us through. Especially when we listen to what those who we need to listen to are saying. Especially when we give ourselves over to song. I don't know where your journey of remembering will take you. May it be beautiful. May it uplift you, even when it drags you under. May you meet your ancestors with care, and may they receive you with love. Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and ReEnchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Samanvaya website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.